This lesson is on multiplying and dividing real numbers, which means the numbers are assigned. So the main thing to remember for both multiplying and dividing is any two negatives, when they come together, make a plus sign. So you've got a negative and you have negative, and they come together to make a plus. So in a question, when you're multiplying and dividing, you're really just going to multiply and divide the numbers as you normally would, and then you're going to basically count up how many negatives that you have. And if there's an even number of negatives, which means every two negatives make a plus sign, your answer will be positive. If you have one left over, so an odd number of negatives, your answer will end up being negative. So here's a couple of questions for you to try. The first one, 3 times 11. Again, we're just going to multiply 3 and 11 as we normally would to get 33. And then we're going to look at our negatives. So I have a negative and another negative. So two negatives. Again, those two negatives come together to make a positive. So that's my answer, is positive 33. For my second one, again, I'm just going to take 6 times 4 as I normally would, which is 24. And then I'm going to look at the negatives. There's one negative and one without, which means they don't match up. And my answer is negative 24. For my third, 12 times 9, again, I'm going to multiply 12 times 9 as I normally would, which is 108. And then I'm going to look at the negatives. Positive times a negative is a negative. And my last one, negative 1 times negative 6. So 1 times 6 is 6. And then the two negatives come together to make a positive. So my answer is positive 6. When we divide sign numbers, we actually follow the exact same steps. So every two negatives become a positive. You're still going to divide the numbers as you normally would. So let's try a few. We have negative 75 divided by negative 3. So I'm going to take 75 divided by 3 as I normally would, and that gives me 25. And then I'm going to look at my negatives. So I have two negatives. Those two negatives come together to make a positive, so my answer is positive. 6 divided by 2, notice I'm ignoring the negative sign, so 6 divided by 2 is 3. And then I'm going to look at the negatives and say a negative and a positive. There's only one negative, so my answer is negative 3. For my third, I have 120 divided by 10. Again, forget about the negatives for a moment. 120 divided by 10 would be 12. And then a positive divided by negative is a negative because there's only one negative. And last one, 10 divided by 2 is 5. And I don't have to worry there about any negatives because all of the answers are positive. The same is going to be true when we multiply fractions. So when we multiply fractions, the positive, negative signs, we're still going to follow those same rules. But you really have two choices when you multiply fractions. So the first is to use the reduction property, which means is to multiply first. So I'm going to take 5 times 2, which is 10, and then I'm going to check my signs. Negative times a negative makes it positive. And then 12 times 3, which is 36. So 10 over 36 is one version of the correct answer, but of course we have to reduce. So now we're going to use the reduction property to reduce and say that 10 and 36 both have a common factor of 2. So I can divide the top by 2 and the bottom by 2. So you can show it this way, where you actually show 2 times that number. Most people just say, okay, I'm going to divide this by 2, and I'm going to divide this by 2, and that's where you get the 5/18. This is not the way I prefer to do things because sometimes these values can be very, very large, and it can be a lot harder for you to be able to reduce. So I usually use option 2, which is to reduce first and then to multiply. So here I have the same question, negative 5/12 times negative 2/3. And as long as one is on top and one is on bottom, I can reduce those. So I'm going to look at 2 and 12, and notice that 2 goes into both 2 and 12. So notice I've crossed out this 2. I've divided 2 by 2 to get 1. Here, I've divided 12 by 2 to get 6. And then I double check, and nothing else can be reduced. This 3 and the 6 have a common factor, but they're both on the bottom, so that makes it so we can't use those to reduce. So now I'm just going to multiply top times top, which is negative 5 times negative 1, or positive 5, and bottom times bottom, so 6 times 3, which is 18. So 5/18 is the same answer either way. It's up to you which one makes more sense to you. Dividing fractions, same idea, except when you divide a fraction, you're actually going to multiply by the reciprocal. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to rewrite the question as a multiplication question by taking the second fraction and flipping it over. So let's take a look down here. I've got an example of 7/8 divided by negative 7/12. So before I reduce, before I try to multiply, I'm going to go ahead and flip that second one over. 7/8 times 12 over 7. Notice I just kept the negative out there. And now I'm going to either multiply and then reduce. So here I would take 7 times 12 to get 84 and 8 times 7 to get 56. And then remember that there's just one negative. And then go through all of the steps to reduce. Now here's an example where I'm actually having to reduce by a rather large number. And this is why I don't like multiplying and then reducing. But if I look here at the second one, here I had a 7, which I divided by 7 to get 1, and a 7, which I divided by 7 to get 1. And then I apparently lost a number down here, but if I divide this by 4, I get 3, and I went ahead and moved that negative up there as well. And if I divide this by 4, I get 2, and now I'm going to multiply across. So 1 times negative 3 is negative 3, 2 times 1 is 2, and then I'm going to reduce that. So this answer is just fine, this answer is just fine too. So here's a couple of practice for you, multiplication and division. I would go ahead and try these first, and then press play on your video again and see how you did. For my first one, this is multiplication. So again, I am a reduce first then multiply person. So I'm going to look at my 2 and say 2 goes into 2 once and into 10 5 times, and nothing else reduces. So now I'm going to multiply numerators, 1 times 7, and multiply denominators, 5 times 5. And if I've done my job correctly here with the reduction, this answer should be in simplest form already. My other multiplication question, notice I have a mixed number times fractions here. So before I can actually multiply these two, I have to turn 1 3/4 into an improper fraction. So if you don't remember how to do that, we're going to take the whole number times the denominator, and then we're going to add the numerator. And so here's why we do that. If we have things broken into 4, 1 3/4 would be like a whole pizza, or 4/4, and then another 3/4, which means total I would have 7/4. So the way to find that 7/4 without having to draw a pizza and count them up is to take 1 times 4, which is 4, plus 3, which gives me 7/4, and then I'm going to multiply it by 2/7, and now I'm going to reduce. So 7 goes into 7 once and into 7 once. And notice I still have a 2 and 4, and those can actually be reduced. So 2 divided by 2 is 1, 4 divided by 2 is 2, and now I'm going to multiply across. 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 1 is 2. Didn't have any weird negatives in there, so my answer is 1/2. My two other questions are division questions. So again, before I do anything else, before I try to reduce or anything, I'm going to go ahead and change this into multiplication. The first one stays the same. Then we change it to multiplication, and the second fraction flips over. And now I'm going to reduce. So 7 goes into 7 once and into 7 once. 2 goes into 6 3 times and into 2 1 time. And now I multiply across, so I get 3 times 1, which is 3, over 1 times 1, which is 1. And hopefully we all know that we don't need to write that 1 on the bottom of a fraction. If it's on the top, you leave it there. If it's on the bottom, it's really not necessary. And our second one, a little bit more difficult. Before I flip anything, I need to go ahead and think about what am I going to do with this 2 1/5. So the same steps that we followed up here. 2 times 5 plus 1 gives me 11/5. And then I'm going to go ahead and change it to multiplication and flip the second one over. So the moment that I change it to multiplication, that's when I have to flip the second fraction. So now I'm going to solve. I'm going to divide this by 11 and this by 11 to get 1s. And then I have a 12 on the top, and then 5 times 1 is 5 on the bottom. Depending on how they ask for the answer, 12/5 might be okay. If you're trying to turn this into an improper fraction, you're going to actually just do some long division. Say 5 goes into 12 2 times evenly, so 2 times 5 is 10, and then you have 2 left over. So this 2, that however many times evenly, is my large number, and then 2/5 is my fraction for the mixed number. So either of these answers are perfectly acceptable. Don't turn them into a decimal, because usually, I mean, this one, you could actually turn it into 2.4, and it would work out okay, but sometimes you end up with messy, ugly decimals, and we try to avoid those.